The Stafford Gambit is finally officially refuted. I'm Grandmaster Igor Smirnov, and without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. This is the video you guys have been asking me for so long, and I had to get my hands dirty and figure it out. So, the Stafford Gambit arises from the King's Pawn move, and it became widely popular in the couple recent years. That's why maybe you're playing the Stafford Gambit yourself as black, or maybe you're facing it as white, but either way, you definitely need to know what I'm about to share with you. Here, after white captures the pawn on e5, instead of trying to recapture the pawn back, black decides to opt for quick development, and they are sacrificing this central pawn so that after this exchange on c6, they are having a free game with their pieces ready to be brought into the game very quickly and to develop a rapid attack. And this line is extremely dangerous for white, as in many lines, white is just losing within 10 moves, I'd say, and there are so many different tricks and traps that black can set for white that it is no surprise why so many players love to play it as black. In many other YouTube videos that are supposedly refuting the Stafford Gambit, they're suggesting to you the move pawn to d3, which can hardly be called a refutation. It is a very defensive move, and it's more of a way to keep up the position and not to lose the game, but definitely not the reputation. The line that I recommend you to play starts with the move pawn to e5, which is obviously the most aggressive move white can play in this position. You don't want to defend, you want to attack. Black is not playing the classical opening, and why would you be so scared of it? And I'm gonna show you that it's not a clickbait video, it is actually a refutation, as in most of the main lines, most common responses of black, you are getting a decisive winning advantage, and I'll show you the game database that it is true. But before we get into it, let me thank you guys so much for your support. By the time this video is published, we'll probably hit 150,000 subscribers on our YouTube channel. It wouldn't be possible without the support from every one of you guys, so I want to thank you so much. It's my great pleasure to be able to serve you. If you aren't subscribed yet, consider doing this right now, because we're having a lot more coming your way. In the next couple of weeks, we're planning a couple of celebrations and giveaways and a lot of good stuff, so consider subscribing and hitting that bell notification. Thank you so much once again. Alright, now let's check the lines. So you're playing pawn to e5 here, attacking the knight, and the knight needs to go somewhere. The two moves we're going to focus on are the most aggressive responses of black, as well as the most common moves, knight to e4 and knight to g4. Black just sacrificed the pawn, and therefore they need to play aggressively in order to, just find some compensation. That's the whole point of playing in a gambit style. That's why we're not going to analyze more passive moves such as, knight g8 or knight d5, because in this case, black does not create any threats, and they're just a pawn down with no big compensation. So here you have no problems. That's why, just like I said, we'll be focusing on the most critical moves that your opponents will be playing most frequently. And the main move for black is knight to e4. This is a really tricky line. It's really in this gambit style, because there is one trap that black sets here in particular. It looks like you can easily chase this knight away by playing pawn to d3. And this is exactly what black is hoping for. Black goes bishop c5, attacking your pawn on f2 with the joint force of their knight and bishop, and if you accept the knight sacrifice, then they're happily taking the pawn on f2, deflecting your king so that on the next move they can win your queen on d1 and it's game over, black is winning. It is one of many traps that black has in the Stafford Gambit, and that is why, once again, it is so effective for black. Of course, that's not the line that I recommend that you play. I just want to show you that you got to be really careful here. Anyway, the first move was correct, pawn to e5. It's just that after black goes knight to e4, the white's move pawn to d3, the most natural response, simply fails due to bishop to c5. It doesn't work. It doesn't force the black's knight away. That's why instead of that, you need to play a better move, pawn to d4. This way, you're shutting down these diagonals so that the black's bishop can't come out on c5 and create any threats for your f2 pawn, which is one of the main ideas for black in the Stafford Gambit. And here you're just shutting it down completely. And in the future, if you ever need to, you can always protect this pawn additionally by playing bishop to e3 or pawn to c3 so that you have the rock solid position in the center. Also, by playing pawn to d4, you somewhat isolate this knight on e4. If you look closer at the knight, you can see that it doesn't have that many squares to escape from this square e4, because all of these many squares around are actually controlled, and the only way back for the knight is to be brought to g5, so that's the only square. And you will often take advantage of an exposed and weak position of this knight in the future. You can easily gain tempos by attacking this knight with one of your pawns or pieces. Well, there's only one pawn that can attack it, so I should say with either of your pieces or a pawn. In this position, black usually goes queen to h4, obviously creating queen takes f2 threat and hoping for another trick. In this case, you gotta be careful, as the wrong move, which is also the most natural move to play, pawn to g3, is losing for white. In this case, black will take that pawn on g3, taking advantage of the pin so that you can't recapture with the h-pawn. In this case, they will just grab your rook with the queen. And if you take with the f-pawn, they have a double attack here with queen to e4, attacking your king and the rook. And that's another tricky line for black, which is something that they're hoping for. But again, forewarned is forearmed. We are not going to be playing bad moves. We are going to be playing good moves. So let's take a few moves back here and see the correct continuation for white. We do know that g3 is the wrong move to play, and the right move is bishop e3, which is actually a better move anyways, as you're developing a piece, you're supporting the d4 pawn, you're protecting the f2 pawn, and again, it's a development move, so it's a good move overall. Black has two most popular responses here. They're developing their bishop either to e6 or to g4. In both of the cases, they're aiming for the queenside castling, trying to create this more imbalanced position because, again, they're pawn down, so they have to look for some sort of counterplay. We'll analyze both of the moves. Let's say they play bishop to e6, and in this case, I would recommend that you play a solid move, knight to d2. Maybe it's not the most ambitious move. For example, bishop to d3 could be more aggressive, just trying to win that knight. But, you know, I also want to show you a simple line that you can apply easily without worrying about any kind of tricks from the black side. So knight to d2 is just a very safe option. In this case, you just want to trade off this knight potentially, which is the only attacking piece of black really, which is standing in the center of the board and can possibly jump somewhere and cause some troubles for you. Funnily enough, in this case, the most common move for black is actually a losing move. They usually castle here, and if they do, this is losing the game immediately because they just overlooked that instead of taking this knight, you are going to say, wait a minute, I can just play pawn to g3 first, drive this queen away, which is currently protecting the knight, and after that, I'm gonna win this knight for nothing instead of an exchange. And here, it's time for black to resign. It's quite nice that you can see right here that it is already you who are setting traps for black if they play the most natural moves, not the other way around as it usually happens in the Stafford Gambit. In this case, after you play pawn to g3, the queen would have to go away, and then you just win the knight. Or if it goes to queen g4, you can just attack it once again with pawn to f3, and inevitably you will win this knight on e4. So that's one of the cool lines for white here. Let's come back to the starting position of the Stafford Gambit once more so that you can memorize the line better. Here you play pawn to e5, they go knight to e4, you play d4, queen h4, taking your pawn, you protect it with a bishop, and if they go bishop to e6, you can play a solid move, knight to d2. We already know that they have to address your threat, as actually you are threatening to play pawn to g3 and then win the knight on e4. Therefore, they have to trade the knights, which is good for you because you're also developing a queen simultaneously. Then they castle queenside and you are doing the same thing. And funnily enough, I checked the database that the two most common moves of black here are losing almost immediately, or literally immediately. One of the common moves for black here is to play king to b8, which fails due to bishop g5, double attack to the queen and the rook. Thus, on the next move, you're gonna probably win the rook for nothing. So that's another cool line where, you know, you win the game right away. And if black is somehow aware of the threat which you have got here, which is bishop to g5, they may also take bishop takes a2. This is a bit better than king to b8, but it's still losing, so it is hard to say which one is worse. Bishop a2 still allows bishop g5, but in this case, I would actually recommend that you go for another line which is even simpler. It is queen to a5, which is a double attack to their bishop and the pawn on a7. All of a sudden, you turn the table and now you are an attacker. they have to move their bishop away, and now you can take the pawn on a7, or you can first attack this bishop once again, and after it goes somewhere, then you take that pawn on a7. Now, you're still a pawn up, that pawn that black sacrificed long ago, but also you are an attacker. Thanks to this queen on a7, you're ready to play queen to a8 check, and maybe then to take this pawn on b7, or just to continue your attack somehow. Thanks to your move pawn to c4 on the previous move, you're also ready to break through in the center with pawn to d5, and with the combined force of this rook along the d file and the queen which is ready to come to a8, you can easily see some checkmating patterns right here, or at the very least a crushing attack. And this position is literally winning for white. You have so many threats, and again, you're a pawn up and you have a lot of threats here, so you are an attacker. Just to show you one simple line, if they play bishop e7 or anything, you can actually break through the center with pawn to d5, because you want to open up the d file and then checkmate black with queen going to a8. So if they take here and you recapture, again, the problem for black is that they can take a pawn, but they always fail to queen e8 check. For example, bishop takes d5, queen e8 check, king d7, rook takes d5, winning the bishop and continuing your attack. That is another line where you're just winning the game. It's time for black to resign. There are just a few more lines that I need to show you in order to have the complete knowledge on how to refute the Stafford Gambit, but let me also give you one bonus tip. In case you are playing the Stafford Gambit yourself as black, you may feel a bit disappointed by the fact that it's being refuted. What can you do? Well, there is a bonus tip here. Most players do not realize that you can actually play the Stafford Gambit as white, not only as black. Here's how you do this. When they play pawn to e5, you go bishop c4. The most common response is knight to f6. Then you sacrifice your pawn on e4, and once they take it, you go knight to c3. You can easily see that this is actually a Stafford Gambit with reversed color and with an additional tempo because you're playing white. And because of that additional tempo, and because of the fact that you already have that bishop on c4, this position is a lot better for white compared to the positions we were analyzing previously. And this line is something I would recommend that you consider. It's a very good line for white. In case you wish to know more about the bishop's opening, which I'm sharing with you one of the lines, you may actually watch another video of mine, which I've recorded particularly about this bishop's opening. It's a really good opening weapon. Alright, let's come back to the Stafford Gambit we're analyzing in this video, in particular how to refute it when you're playing white. So there is the line, you go pawn to e5, then you play pawn to d4, queen h4, bishop e3, and previously we analyzed the move bishop e6, which was pretty bad for black. Now let's also take a look at bishop g4, another common move of black. Then you play bishop e2, of course you need to cover your king, then after an exchange of pieces, they'll probably still castle queenside, and then you can castle kingside because it is ready. Since you developed your bishop already, you can do this immediately and put your king in safety. Now, let me just say a few words about this position. You are still having an extra pawn, that pawn on e5, which is a very strong pawn. Black has no attack here whatsoever. The queen on h4 is actually doing nothing at all. So there's nothing to worry about for you overall. What can you do generally speaking? Well, you can play pawn to f3 and kick this knight away, or you can play pawn to f4 just to support your center and to isolate this knight on e4 even more. You can also develop your knight to c3, which will finalize your development as well as trade that active knight on e4. So these are the main ideas for you. For example, if they play pawn to f6 trying to undermine your center, you may wish to protect it, but before playing pawn to f4, you may play an intermediate move pawn to f3 to drive the knight away, so that after it goes to g5, you can play this move pawn to f4 with a tempo, and after they go back to e4, now you go knight to c3, finalizing your development, and after an exchange of the knights, you can just see that your position is rock solid. Black has no attack whatsoever, you've got an extra pawn, which is a strong passed pawn on e5, and the position is completely winning for white. Another way for black instead of pawn to f6 could be trying to play pawn to f5 and then maybe hoping for pawn to f4 and develop some sort of an attack there on the king side. But I've got you covered. You still play knight to c3, trading off that active knight on e4, and after an exchange, if they try to play this move pawn to f4, well, first of all, it's not really dangerous. You could just move your bishop away and everything's good. But there is even a better trick, much better. You can play a counter blow, pawn to g3, attacking their queen, and therefore they have to trade pawns. Now you recapture with the f pawn, and now your rook all of a sudden is controlling an open file and it's ready to invade into f7 or f4 somewhere. And again, the situation for white is just so advantageous. You're still having an extra pawn, you're having this open file for the rook, you're fully developed, unlike black, and you have just an advantage all around here. Now let's come back to the starting position. Once again, you're playing pawn to e5, and the final line that we need to analyze here is knight to g4. Another tricky idea of black trying to combine an attack of your pawn on e5 and possibly putting some pressure to your pawn on f2. Then you still play pawn to d4, the same move, protecting the pawn on e5, also shutting down these diagonals so that they can never place their bishop there anymore. And now black is, well, once again in trouble. You are preparing to play pawn to h3 and kick this knight away. That's why they can't just play any random move. If they would do something simple like bishop e6, then you indeed play pawn to h3, inviting the knight to retreat to h6, which would be, completely bad for black. If they do that, they just have to acknowledge that their attack failed and they sacrificed the pawn for no reason. Moreover, you can actually trade this knight and disrupt their pawn structure, and then knight to c3 and something like queen to d2, castle, and everything's great. You have a completely superior position here. Now let's take a few moves back and see if black can try any tricks as they usually do. Let's say they're trying, instead of retreating with the knight, let's say they're trying queen h4, playing in this Stafford Gambit style, taking advantage of the pin and putting pressure to your pawn on f2. Then you just play pawn to g3, of course. Then black's queen will have to go back, and you just win the knight and win the game. If black tries to maintain the pin along the h-file, then you can't take right away so that you lose the rook, but you can just protect it first, and then black has nothing to do. The knight is pinned, and on the next move, inevitably, you will take it, winning the game. Let me show you the final cool line here. So after e5 and they go knight to g4, you play pawn to d4. Most of your opponents will actually play pawn to c5, trying to attack you so that if you take, black certainly will have a lot of good stuff here. They can trade queens, then take the pawn on f2, but that's not what you want. Instead, you will simply play pawn to h3, first of all pushing their knight away from g4. You're not reacting to their pawn to c5, it's not a major threat anyway, so you want to push the knight away. After it goes back to h6, then once again, instead of trading the pawns, which would give black some initiative indeed, you can go pawn to d5, just shutting down the position in the center, obtaining these beautiful pawns in the center, and black's position is also completely passive. They have all of their pieces on the back rank and one knight on the edge of the board, which can clearly indicates to you that they have no attacking potential at all. Now, what can they do next? Usually they'll try to play knight to f5, because first of all, this knight was doing nothing. Also, potentially you were ready to exchange it with your bishop from c1, so they go knight to f5, you go knight to c3, and if they try knight d4, trying to put it more actively and maybe support it with a bishop, I mean, first of all, there is nothing dangerous here at all, but you can play bishop e3 and kick this knight away immediately, because it's being attacked. Now, if they go knight to f5 and taking your bishop, you play queen f3 to support the bishop and to prepare the queenside castling. And if they try knight d4, once again trying to somehow complicate matters, because again, with their pawn down, they need to try to complicate matters, then you trade the knight here. And when your opponent thinks that they somehow, managed to put you in trouble, you go bishop b5 check, the counter blow, they have to cover the king. And now when your opponent thinks that they obtained some sort of counterplay, your bishop is hanging here, your knight is hanging, maybe the bishop is ready to come out to b4. Well, first of all, certainly you may say something like this. And here comes another boom, pawn to e6, winning the game immediately. You're taking advantage of the pin right here, as well as queen takes f7 is a major threat, which black cannot avoid. They can trade pawns on e6, but it doesn't change anything. Now you're attacking the bishop here, as well as queen to f7 is coming, and so it's time for black to resign. Here comes a little quiz for you. We just analyzed the move knight to d4, which loses in a spectacular way. What if they play another move, knight takes e3? In this case, you recapture, they go bishop e7, then you can still deliver the same check bishop b5, developing your bishop with a tempo. And after they cover, here's the position where I want to ask you to think about and to write it down in the comments below. How are you gonna play here as white? Please do not share this video with any of your friends or any social media channels, because instead you want to crush them with this newly obtained knowledge. Instead, you may wish to join my free masterclass by clicking the link below the video.